They say the best revenge is living well, but the real best revenge is sitting across from your enemies and letting them think they've already won. The thing about wealth is that nobody believes you have it when you look like you don't. I drive a 2008 Ford Ranger with a dented tailgate. I wear a Timex watch. It tells time, and that's enough. My name is Arthur Crane. For 20 years, I've owned Crane Manufacturing, a logistics company that quietly dominates its sector. We employ nearly 3,500 people. But walk up to me on a Saturday outside my Roanoke house wearing a paint-stained sweatshirt, and you'd hand me a coupon, not a boardroom seat. That's exactly how I like it. My daughter Elena didn't inherit my love of invisibility. She's brilliant, warm, and has her mother's taste for ambitious men. When she brought Daniel Cross home 3 years ago, I shook his hand and thought, this man has never been told no. There's a particular shine to people like that. Daniel wasn't bad. He was smart, confident. When I quietly vetted him, yes, I vet my daughter's boyfriends, his credentials were solid. So when Elena got serious, I did something I'd never done in 20 years. I made Daniel Cross the CEO of Crane Manufacturing. He had no idea who he was really working for. As far as he knew, he'd been recruited by a prestigious firm. I just greased the door. Elena knew. She thought it was equal parts sweet and insane. For 14 months, everything was fine. Daniel ran the company well. Then, one Thursday, Daniel called. "Arthur, I want you to meet my parents properly. They've been asking about you." Something shifted in my stomach. "Sure," I said. The restaurant had no prices on the menu. I wore my cleanest flannel. Daniel met me at the door in a jacket worth more than my first car. He didn't flinch of my shirt. Inside, Walter and Patricia Cross were already seated. Walter shook my hand with both palms, the double-handed shake that means you're either deeply sincere or deeply calculating. "Arthur," he said, "we've heard so much about you." Patricia touched my arm and said I looked wonderfully comfortable, which meant she'd clocked my flannel and filed it under "not a threat." We made small talk. Walter asked about my property. I told him I grew tomatoes. 40 minutes in, Walter reached into his blazer and pulled out a thick cream envelope. He placed it on the table, deliberately, the way you place something when you want the other person to understand it matters. "Arthur," he said, voice dropping, "there are things about your past that deserve a conversation." I looked at the envelope. I looked at Daniel, suddenly fascinated by his salmon. 20 years of silence. 20 years of believing what happened with Richard Cross stayed buried. I took a slow sip of water. "Walter, before I open that, you should know something. I never sit down at a table I haven't already flipped." I didn't open the envelope right away. Walter had choreographed this moment, and choreography only works when the other person follows the steps. I cut into my steak, chewed slowly, let the silence sit like a fifth guest. After 45 seconds, I reached for the envelope. Inside were documents, copy-copied, neat, deliberate. I didn't need to read them. The name at the top told me everything. Richard Cross. In 1992, Richard and I were partners in Columbus. For 4 years, we built a manufacturing outfit together. And for 4 years, I ignored that Richard was skimming, quietly, consistently, until the structure was hollow. By 1996, he'd siphoned enough to fund a competing operation using our stolen client list. I spent 6 months documenting everything. Then I sat across from Richard and gave him a choice. Walk away, sign over his stake, and disappear, or I take everything to the DA. He chose to disappear. What I didn't know was that Richard had a younger brother, a 12-year-old who grew up hearing one side of a story from a broken man who never admitted what he'd done, a boy named Walter. I looked up. Walter was watching with the intensity of a man who'd waited decades. "Richard kept records," Walter said, "everything you did to him." "Walter, I'm sorry about your brother, but what he told you wasn't the truth." "I don't want your condolences." "I know. What do you want?" He leaned forward. "Resign from Crane Manufacturing, pay a settlement to my family, before my son's name gets attached to whatever comes next." Daniel finally looked up. His face wasn't a conspirator's. It was a man who just realized dinner was never just dinner. "How long have you known?" I asked Daniel directly. He exhaled. "Dad told me when Elena and I got serious. He said there was a debt." Patricia put her hand on mine. "Arthur, we're family now." I looked at her smile, then placed my own envelope on the table. Smaller, white, unremarkable. "Richard's records are incomplete," I said. "Inside are the original bank records, the wire transfers to a shell company, and the correspondence where Richard discussed stealing our clients, and an affidavit from his accountant who is very much alive and willing to testify." Walter's confidence crumbled. "You destroyed him." "He destroyed himself. Then he told you a story that let him die a victim." Walter stood. Patricia touched his arm. "Sit down," I said, "because the part that matters now is your son." I turned to Daniel. "I know who you are. I've known since before you met Elena." "Daniel, how did you get your job?" "The search firm, the board." "That firm was contracted by me. The board reports to me. The position exists inside a company I own entirely. Arthur Crane, founder and sole owner of Crane Manufacturing. You've been running my company in a chair I placed you in." "Why?" The word came out younger than he intended. "This was me being a father." Daniel looked at Walter. Something shifted in his eyes, something colder. "How long? Before Elena and I got serious, you positioned me. You let me fall in love with her because I was your way in." Patricia reached for him. "Your Uncle Richard?" "Don't." Daniel pulled back. "Don't bring up Richard." Walter tried. "Everything I did was for this family." "To what?" Daniel's voice cracked. "Extort my father-in-law over a story that wasn't even true?" Walter had no answer. Daniel turned to me, composed now, the face of a CEO. "I owe you an apology. You didn't know. I knew enough to feel something was wrong tonight, and I came anyway." He looked at his plate. "I sat here while my father put that envelope in front of you and looked at my plate. That's not who I want to be." I watched him for a long moment. "No, it isn't. And that's why you still have a job Monday." I turned to Walter. "Those documents are harmless to me. I'm not pursuing anything, not because I couldn't, but because grief makes people do things the undamaged version of themselves never would. I'm sorry about how Richard told you his story." I leaned forward. "But Daniel is CEO of my company. Elena is a majority shareholder. Your son married into something you spent years trying to take a piece of. The only reason any of that remains available to your family is because he just proved he is not you." Walter folded his napkin and placed it on the table, the gesture of a man with nothing left. "We should go," he said to Patricia. He paused at Daniel's shoulder. "I'll call you." "Not tonight," Daniel said. "Later." The distance in those words could have filled the restaurant. The waiter appeared. "Dessert?" "Yes," I said. "The chocolate thing, too, and real coffee." Daniel exhaled. "Arthur, do you actually trust me to run the company? Not as Elena's husband, as a CEO." I considered. 6 months ago, you restructured distribution and saved us $4 million. You did it without being asked. So yes." He nodded slowly. "But Monday, we're having a proper conversation, no gaps." The corner of his mouth moved. "You're not stopping the flannel, are you?" "The flannel is non-negotiable." He laughed, a real one. I drove home in my Ford Ranger. I thought about Richard, the man he was before greed got him. About Walter sitting somewhere with a story to rebuild. About what it means to build something. Not just a company, but a way of moving through the world so when someone comes for you, you're not caught off guard. You're already home. My phone buzzed. "Daniel, I told Elena everything. She says you're impossible and she loves you. Also, she agrees the flannel is embarrassing." I typed back,
Tell her the flannel built her inheritance. Some men build empires to prove something. Arthur Crane built his to protect something. There's a difference. Tonight, everyone at the table understood it.